Italy, September 1943. World War II has raged for over 4 years and the country is breaking apart. After years of alliance with Nazi Germany, Italy signs an armistice with the Allied forces who had invaded Sicily just weeks earlier. In response, German troops pour into central and northern Italy, occupying cities, disarming Italian soldiers, and restoring control through violence. As fascist rule in Italy collapses, the resistance begins to rise. Italian partisans, many of them former soldiers, communists, or civilians, take to the hills and streets to fight against the occupiers. The German response is swift and brutal. In Rome, after a partisan attack on 23 March 1944 kills 33 German soldiers, the Nazi command decides to carry out a cruel reprisal. 1 day later, in the Atrocity caves in Rome, German forces murder 335 civilians and political prisoners. However, this atrocity will not remain unpunished, and the main perpetrators will be hunted down and brought to justice. Italy had entered the Second World War on 10 June 1940, declaring war on France and the United Kingdom. The Second World War had begun earlier, on 1 September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Under the fascist dictatorship of Benito Mussolini, Italy aligned itself with Nazi Germany for years, hoping to gain territory and restore the imperial glory of ancient Rome. Italian forces fought alongside German troops in North Africa, the Balkans, and on the Eastern Front. These campaigns brought suffering rather than success. Equipment was poor, leadership was often ineffective, and defeats soon followed one another. Italian soldiers endured hunger, cold, and heavy losses, and at home, civilians faced shortages, bombings, and growing doubt about their role in the global conflict. As the Axis position weakened, faith in the regime eroded, and resentment toward Germany increased. On 25 July 1943, after Allied troops landed in Sicily at the beginning of the month, Mussolini was removed from power by order of the Italian King Victor Emmanuel III and placed under arrest. A new government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio sought a way out of the war, and in September 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. The announcement brought chaos instead of peace as Nazi Germany reacted immediately with Operation Ahas, a rapid military takeover of central and northern Italy. Italian units were disarmed, soldiers were captured, and German forces seized Rome and other major cities. Mussolini was rescued from his imprisonment by German commandos and installed as head of the Italian Social Republic in the north, a puppet state entirely dependent on German power and military. Southern Italy came under Allied control, but Rome remained occupied by Germans, its population trapped between fear, hunger, and violence. Under the occupation, the German army and the SS imposed harsh control. The German security services operated prisons and carried out arrests, interrogations, and torture. Jewish families were hunted down, deported, or killed on the spot. Political opponents and suspected partisans disappeared into prisons and were never seen again. At the same time, resistance groups grew bolder and sabotages, assassinations, and bombings became more frequent. The occupiers responded with collective punishments and civilians were executed, hostages taken, and entire communities threatened. In this atmosphere, the Atrocity Caves massacre took shape. The immediate trigger came on 23 March 1944. In the afternoon, around 3 o'clock, a bomb exploded in Via Rasella, near the center of Rome. The attack was carried out by members of the Italian communist resistance. The explosion struck a marching unit of the ELEVN Letter 1D57 aspirated company of the SS Police Regiment Bozen, made up largely of South Tyrolians. 33 Germans were killed and dozens more were wounded. The timing of this attack was symbolic, as it was the anniversary of the infamous fascist black shirts which had been founded by Mussolini on 23 March 1919. The message was clear, but the German reaction to this symbolic act was immediate and ruthless. That same evening, senior German officers met to decide on retaliation. Generaloberst Eberhard von Mackensen, the commander of the FOURTEEN Letter 1D57 aspirated army responsible for the defense of Rome, General of Aviators Kurt Melzer, city commander of Rome, and Herbert Kappler, the SS officer who led the security police and SC in Rome, agreed on a brutal plan. 10 Italians would be executed for every German killed. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, officer responsible for all Axis units in Italy, approved the proposal, and later that night Adolf Hitler confirmed this decision. The order demanded speed and secrecy, and Generaloberst Alfred Jadl, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, determined that the execution of the civilians was to be carried out by the following evening. Initially, 330 victims were required. When one of the wounded German policemen later died, the number rose again, and Herbert Kappler was tasked with organizing the killings by Jadl. Herbert Kappler drew names from prison lists. He selected Jews waiting for deportation, political prisoners, resistance members, and men arrested simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some had been imprisoned for months, others for only a few days, and many had never been sentenced or formally charged. They were teachers, workers, lawyers, officers, artists, priests, fathers, sons, and brothers. Some families would later discover that more than one relative had been taken. On 24 March, the prisoners were transported in trucks to the Ardeatine caves. Their hands were bound with rope to limit their movement. Inside the caves, they were led forward in groups of 5. They were ordered to kneel. Shots were fired into the back of their heads. So officers Erich Priebe and Karl Theodor Schutz crossed names off the lists as the men were killed. Kappler himself participated in the executions. As bodies piled up, the next victims were forced to kneel on top of the dead. The executions continued for hours, and the prisoners who were waiting under guard in front of the caves could hear the sounds of gunfire. After the final shots, explosives were detonated to seal the caves. Some victims may still have been alive when the rock collapsed on them. The massacre was announced only the next day through an official German communiqué. It described the dead as criminals and communists and claimed that the killings were lawful. It did not mention the Jewish hostages, the innocent prisoners, or the secret nature of the executions. Across Rome, families searched prisons and hospitals for their loved ones, but silence was the only answer. After the liberation of Rome on 4 June 1944, the sealed caves were opened and the truth was finally revealed. Inside the Ardeatine caves, officials found the bodies buried under collapsed rock and dust, piled one on top of another exactly as they had fallen. The air was heavy and the space was narrow, making the recovery slow and painful. Many bodies were still bound with rope, some unrecognizable from injuries and decomposition. Personal items, scraps of clothing, documents, and rings were carefully collected to help families identify their loved ones. In the years that followed, 326 of the 335 victims were identified. Among them were the resistance leader, Colonel Giuseppe Cordero Lanza de Montezemolo, the philosopher and teacher Paolo Albertelli, and the Jewish refugee Heinz Erich Tuchman. 75 of the murdered were Jews. The youngest victim was 15 years old. The oldest was 74. The massacre became a symbol of Nazi brutality in Italy and a wound that never healed. After the war, justice finally came for the perpetrators. Pietro Caruso, the fascist chief of police of Rome in 1944, who together with Herbert Kappler took part in the organization of the Ardeatine Caves massacre by compiling hostage lists and facilitating the transfer of victims to the execution site, was arrested after the liberation of Rome. He was tried by an Italian court, sentenced to death for his crimes, and executed by a firing squad in the courtyard of Fort Brevetta in Rome on 22 September 1944. Generaloberst Alfred Jadl, who had confirmed the reprisal order, was sentenced to death at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg and executed on 16 October 1946. The request by Jadl's defense team for execution by firing squad instead of hanging was denied. The reason was the criminal rather than military nature of his acts during the war. Jadl was executed by American Army Sergeant John C. Woods, who was deliberately bad at his job to make the 10 Nazi war criminals that he executed on 16 October 1946 suffer as they all died a long, agonizing death. The 56-year-old Jodl was hanged, but because he fell from the gallows with insufficient force to snap his neck, his horrible convulsing lasted 18 long minutes before he died. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was sentenced to death in 1947, though his punishment was later reduced and he was released in 1952. Generaloberst Eberhard von Mackensen and General of Aviators Kurt Melzer were also sentenced to death. But their sentences were commuted and Melzer died in prison in 1952. Officer Herbert Kappler was tried in Rome in 1948 and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of all 335 victims. He remained imprisoned for decades. In August 1977, suffering from cancer and weighing just 47 kilograms or 103 pounds, he escaped from a military hospital with the help of his wife, who smuggled him out in a large suitcase. Kappler fled to Germany, where he died 6 months later. Officer Erich Priepi fled to Argentina after the war and lived freely for 50 years, but in 1996 he was extradited to Italy and 2 years later tried and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in 2013. Karl Haas, another SS officer involved, was also sentenced to life imprisonment in 1998. What remained after the trials and the sentences was memory. The Arditine caves did not speak, but they endured. Stone, earth, and darkness held the trace of what had happened there. In the years after the war, the caves were transformed into a memorial, and each name carved in stone replaced the attempt to erase a life. The massacre had been meant to silence a city, yet it became one of the clearest testimonies of occupation and terror in Italy. Long after uniforms disappeared and orders lost their power, the memorial caves continued to remind visitors of the cost of violence and obedience. The dead could not be brought back, but they were no longer hidden. Their presence endured as a warning and as a demand that what happened in Rome on 24 March 1944 would never be denied or forgotten.